participatory culture. This is a thing that's been much heralded as sort of the exciting new turn of the late 20th, start of the 21st century. We'll hear a little bit more about it today, maybe with Facebook. On the other hand, it's been lamented by people who talk about a culture that's out of control, a culture of amateurs. There seems to be kind of the Atlantic Ocean is a bit of a divide. In America, we tend to be much more optimistic about these things, whereas in Europe, there's quite a bit of criticism and serious interrogation of the limits of these participatory models. Certainly at the university world, Wikipedia is something like a generational rift in the tectonics of thought. You know, should we go to sources that are attributable and fixed and firm, or should we leave it up to the wisdom of the crowd? And as I say, this is kind of a generational fault line. The new, and I guess participatory culture is heralded often as new, certainly has some new dimensions, but it also has a lot of precedent. And I'll point to that precedent, but I also want to point to something underneath it, something that, I guess, a newness that is not really much reflected upon, but that offers us, I think, a new sense of self-definition. This is a remarkable image to me, and it's an image that stands as the culmination, in a way, of the modern era. I mean, this image you can, in a certain way, track back to René Descartes, a notion of a clear, although this is taken from a space none of us have inhabited, none of us have ever been privileged to see from this vantage point, we understand this image in a really fundamental way. We understand the object-subject relations. We understand the three-point perspective within which this is inscribed. This stands as the culmination of a regime of engineering, a regime of technology and mathematics that both brought us to the moon, but also that positions us in very clear ways between we, the viewing subject, or the photographing subject, and the objects out there in the world. And someone that's talked a lot about this, I think in really profound ways, is Martin Heidegger, who talks about the modern era in terms of what he calls the world picture. Heidegger does not mean a picture of the world. What he means is the world imagined, conceived of as a picture. That's something that to him would have been inconceivable in the Middle Ages or in the ancient period, but characterizes the modern, that we see the world, we represent the world. This is not about interpretation, it's about how we grasp experience around us. That we can fix it, that we can order it, that we can pin it down is the thing that he talks about. Now, this notion of the image is tied to, this notion of the world as image, coincides with a bunch of things. And I just want to point to some of them. This is one that turns on kind of a definitional distinction that's quite important between the algorithm, a word that we don't use very much, but still a word, and the algorithm. And what you see here is a kind of word use index. And you can see that the word algorithm, which essentially means what we would call arithmetic, mathematics, the calculable, that's something that really kicks in a big way in the 15th century, around the time that the book is invented, around the time the three-point perspective is introduced into the world, and lasts pretty much up until the 20th century, at which point the algorithmic takes over. And the algorithmic is something that's more of a process. It's a formula. It's not a calculation. It's a formula. It's a procedure. And obviously, why it kicks up in a big way, because it's not necessarily such a new concept, has to do with computers. But it's not the computers that are the trick. It's the algorithmic procedures within them is where the action is. This is another chart that maps actually the deployment of algorithms. And you can see that, Euclid, I mean, there's a whole history, a long history of people trying to do stuff with algorithms. It's again, not a brand new concept, but in terms of deployment, it's an emphatically 20th century, 21st century entity. Now, what's interesting with this algorithmic, this older regime, the algorithm, is that it's the underpinnings of something like three-point perspective. It comes about at a moment when our cultures are changing in the 15th, 16th century, when we go from alchemy to chemistry, when we go from astrology to astronomy. This notion of sort of scientific rule sets, of fixities, of certainties, and certainly within mathematics that's happening, and three-point perspective is a really tangible manifestation of that regime. And what's so wonderful about three-point perspective is that it literalizes this notion of a viewing subject and an objective world, right? It's pinned down. It's a mathematical formula. Follow the formula, and you can't go wrong. So this really literalizes what, to someone like Descartes in the 16th century, wants to talk about in terms of these rule sets, these finite rule sets that can pin down the notion of consciousness and the world we see. Our notion of being a subject, our notion of being kind of the center of our own little worlds, is born in this era. Philosophically, there's a lot of grounds to say that. And it's articulated in this era visually and, you know, in our painted culture, in our architectural regimes. We can really see this notion of, you know, the eye that views the world. And it's this regime, I want to argue, that's kind of changing right now. There's a narrative, I mean, this is sort of so taken for granted, this way of seeing that it seems like it's just nature. But I want to argue that it's actually nurture. This way of seeing the world that, you know, for the last couple hundred years has been part of our world isn't necessarily the part of other worlds, other cultures, and certainly historical cultures. They had other ways of representing and arguably other ways of seeing. So the question about how we see is a really interesting question. Is this a trained regime or is this a natural regime? And this would be evidence that says, actually, there's some training involved. And it's reinforced every day by our optics systems. I mean, the glasses I'm wearing or the lenses on our cameras are all about reinforcing a particular way of seeing the world. This way has been elaborated, and someone like Jonathan Crary, whose book there is in the bottom left-hand side there, Crary would argue that if you think about our media history from sort of the, you know, drawing and painting in three-point perspective up through the panorama, you know, into something like through film and television into virtual reality, even Second Life, what we see is we have a narrative of progress. We're getting ever better at fixing this perspective. But Crary warns us that we're also ever more trapping the viewer. These systems require ever greater fixity and entrapment of the viewer. For him, there's an ideological agenda. Let me just make a jump to the notion of participatory culture, and then I want to come back to this visual regime, but replayed through the algorithm to sort of see what the difference would be. So participation, although it's much heralded today as the big thing, has of course been around with us forever. And in fact, what's interesting about the notion of participation is how it gets overwritten at the start of the 20th century by our culture industries, right? Once we start to industrialize cultural production, we seem to override and overwrite these robust notions of participation. They've been around forever. We have a couple of conditions today that are certainly enhancing and bringing back the relevance of participation. Moore's law is still with us, the idea that transistor capacity doubles every 18 months. And what that means is ever cheaper memory. And you know, if you bought your USB sticks, you're probably up to 32 now for $12.95. I mean, the price is dropping incredibly, and that continues. We know that in terms of the transmission speeds that we're looking at right now, I think about a year and a half ago, Alcatel-Lucent broke the 25 terabit mark. That's transmitting 600 DVDs per second. And they anticipate breaking the 100 terabit mark. That's the contents, the printed contents of Library of Congress, transmitted in 4.5 seconds. So it's sort of a remarkable notion of speed, and it's a paradigm changer in terms of, are we going to be a culture of storage or a culture of circulation? It's a really, really interesting development. And we have things like Yellow Arrow, or even the mouse, the mighty mouse that was in our bag of goodies. What is that exactly? Is that a navigational instrument? Is it a semiotic device? Do we send messages or meanings through it? Is it an instrument of economic transaction? It's all of those things. We don't quite even have language for some of the new forms that are emerging. But combined, and certainly underwritten by the algorithm, these things are making a lot of new developments possible. They're accelerating developments that have been in the works for years, and thus the sort of steep curve of the algorithm that I talked about earlier. You can see this notion of participation play out in really interesting ways. 85,000 apps that the iPhone has, I think, is one of the key drivers for people to make the choice for the iPhone as opposed to the Palm with its mere 100 apps. Something like SETI at Home, which is about sort of tracking extraterrestrial messages, but using grid computing, using thousands of home computers shackled together. Again, a profound act of collaboration made possible by an algorithmic underlay. We have a whole taxonomy in this fast-changing area of things like open source and the commons model, where the creativity of many individuals is brought together, not just to produce new tools, but also to actually control the rule sets that those tools are deployed through. Even in the design world, I don't know if you track, this is a car with an open source plan. Wikipedia would be another terrific example of this, where the wisdom of the crowd is there both in terms of contributing, but also in terms, to a large extent, of setting some of the rules. The Web 2.0 model is a little different because there is a kind of proprietary edge. People that don't know one another have the affordance of being brought together, but someone's providing the platform, and they provide the platform for a reason. They can sell ads, generate some revenue, and lots of those out there. And crowdsourcing, which is an extraordinarily proprietary model, which is using the wisdom of the crowd for profit and sort of a cheap labor source, but also sort of, especially with things like incentives, some really remarkable ways to solve problems in ways that would not be solved within existing structures, or to get your own t-shirt out there on the market. So there's a bunch of different approaches here, but common to them all is this notion of the algorithm. Now what I'd like to do is just drill down a little bit on its implications for the visual. I made a big deal about this three-point perspective and a particular way of seeing. How many of you have fooled around with photosynth? It's a remarkable system that can essentially synthesize together hundreds, thousands of photos. If you put Piazza San Marco in, it can crawl the web, it can crawl Flickr, pull out anything that's tagged with that. And if it can match it up through a series of pretty complex algorithms, it forms a kind of seething space. So it allows us to just move into Piazza San Marco, and literally any photos that anyone out there in the world took and coded in a way that this system can find, those photos are there. So it might be a close-up of mosaics or of bricks. The system simply works by finding sites of uniqueness and then algorithmically correlating all the other images to it. If we think about the whole project from Descartes, more or less up until that moonshot I showed you, this is all about specifying the subject and the object, making very clear the notion of who is responsible, from whose point of view this is taken. Point of view is crucial. But where is the agency in something like photosynth? Whose agency is represented in all these photos? Like Wikipedia, a lot of people's agency, but it's radically recombined, recontextualized, so that in fact, it's very hard to know from whose perspective we're seeing. The notion of subjectivity is fleeting, it's fragmentary, it's radically recontextualized. The whole project of subject-object relations that have been so central to the modern era are here being radically reconfigured. And it strikes me that this is a space that we really need to think critically about. The old logics of expertise, the old notion of the transcendent subject, we're the boss, it's our world, is being reconfigured. Now, again, phenomenally we see this in all these manifestations of participatory culture, the we that is Wikipedia or any of those other examples I gave. But underneath it is a motor that is largely outside our critical gaze. So I guess, I posed the question at the beginning, can this change the way that we are? And I think the accent is on the word we. Because what we're seeing here is an enablement of a new perspective, a perspective that very much is about a we as opposed to an I. To put it in Heidegger's terms, that world picture that has defined the modern era is now being changed and radically reconfigured. And I think something like photosynth is a really terrific emblem to think about that. Is it a picture, a movie, a slideshow? What the hell is it exactly? But whatever it is, it's something where the we is emphatically part of it, where the algorithmic tracking of your behaviors within it is something that feeds back into the system, or potentially feeds back into the system. And the question is, where is the control? Where is the agency behind that? Now, I posed that question as someone brought up in the modern era, looking for agency, but for younger people growing up in this world, that's not necessarily a question that would be asked. So I'm trying to say this is a space, if we want to think about invention, this is a remarkable shift in how we imagine ourselves and our relationship to the world. This shift between, Canaletto's picture on the one hand, with its stability, its fixity, its intersubjectivity, a clearly defined point of view, versus something that's processual, randomized. Every encounter is unique. What you find on this is never going to be the same as what I find. Who's the subject and who's the object, and how has that relationship been reconfigured? The specificities, paradoxically, are both enhanced and muted at the same time. We can find very particular things, and yet we don't know their source. We don't know what they exactly mean. One is a spatially based encounter, and one is emphatically turning on the notion of experience. So we know that the collaborative is still with us, and we know what the constraints or the guiding rules for this kind of collaboration are, this kind of participation. We know that why these kind of systems like barn raisings work is because of the standardized length of lumber or because of the role of tradition. Both of those are wonderful constraining events. We know, I mean, if you break out a textbook on architecture and algorithms, you'll find this kind of stuff. Yeah, we can make interesting new surfaces and come up, you know, Frank Gehry uses this to death, and you can sort of find some wonderful ways of coming up with some creative stuff. But something else is at hand. And if you look at the way our chips are being designed, where hundreds of people are working together and collaborating, where the agency of any one of them within this particular architectural model is not exactly clear, and yet the end result is something that really is transformative for us all, this comes much closer to this notion of the algorithmic. So I just want to close with this reassuring image of the past, this reassuring, you know, emblem of the algorithmic era of precision, of stability, and of point of view, even though it's a pretty radical point of view, to say that we're on the cusp of something new. I don't want to do this through hand waving, but I do want to say that what that new is the engagement with this algorithmic dimension. And that we mistake this, if we just look to the surface dimension at these enablements of participation, that's interesting and it's important, but there's something underneath that we have not attended closely to, and it's the game changer. This is where the conditions of change are. And this is a space we really have to engage in. And so with that, I will stop because I see my time is just about out. Thanks very much.